Well, good evening, and thank you again for coming and joining us here tonight. And it's great to be part of this great panel, to see so many familiar faces and people in the room. Again, I'm Chris Crom with the Institute for Southern Studies. We're a media and research nonprofit based in Durham, founded by civil rights veterans. And we do a lot of investigative media and research, trying to shine a light on issues and people that we don't think are getting enough attention. And I just got to say, every time I come up to Asheville, I tell my staff and my lovely wife, I'm just like, do you think we could move the Institute to Asheville? Everybody has some office space. We might look into that. But so you heard a lot tonight about what's going wrong. You've heard about the attacks on schools. You heard about the attacks on voting rights, on the democratic process. And you've heard about an extreme agenda that protects the interests of elite few, but locks out the voices of ordinary North Carolinians. So the question is, where is this agenda coming from? Who or what is driving it? What makes it so successful? And there is one man who's had a lot to do with what's happening in North Carolina right now. This person is the top big money power broker in the state. For years, he operated in the shadows, and he likes it there. Too often, the media's silence kept us, the public, in the dark. But finally, over the last year, the people have started to hear about our Pope. Now, just quick, to get a quick show of hands, there's no right or wrong answer to this. Who here in the room, like about 5 years ago, had heard of the name our Pope? Okay, just a smatter. Yeah, well, yeah, and so like over just the last year, who's maybe heard about this guy, our Pope? Okay, a lot more hands, right? And so, and if you didn't know about our Pope, it's not your fault, right? He was one of Raleigh's best kept secrets, the wizard behind the curtain. He was pumping millions of dollars into politics to buy influence and funding the right-wing movement in our state, but only a handful of insiders really knew about him and his political machine. At the Institute, we've been investigating Pope for about 20 months now. A lot of time to spend looking at this guy. And I just wanted to share a little bit about what we found. So first of all, our Pope is the poster child for big money influence in our democracy. And here he is right here. I don't know if you've seen his face before. But in North Carolina, no other person is channeling as much money or orchestrates as big of a political network as our Pope. Over the last 10 years, he has pumped $40 million into buying political influence. That is, one, it's money that him and his family have given to politicians, more than $3 million over the last 10 years. Just in 2010, they injected more than $250,000 in just a couple dozen races. So it was a lot of money for those races that he's pumping in. This is money from his business, Variety Wholesalers, a discount retail chain that owns Roses and Maxway. I'm sure you have one in this here in Asheville. That gives to outside groups that run these attack ads. These are 2010, these three groups, Americans for Prosperity, Civitas Action, Real Jobs North Carolina. They accounted for 75%, 3 out of 4 of the outside dollars that came flooding in to the state legislative elections. Of those 24 races that Pope's family and groups targeted, Republicans won nearly 80% of those races. It's also money flowing from his family foundation, which Mr. Pope took over in 2006 and he largely runs. The Pope Foundation also shovels tens of millions of dollars into openly conservative and right-wing causes. Now, Mr. Pope tries to deny this. In 2010, he actually told the Raleigh News and Observer that a mere fraction of his money goes to these right-wing political groups. Well, that very year, 2010, 70% of our Pope's money went to these right-wing groups, Americans for Prosperity, the Civitas Institute, the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute. If you call 70% a mere fraction, well, it's a big fraction. And in North Carolina, you really see the impact of this money. In this state, our Pope's Foundation supplies 85 to 90% of the income of all the leading right-wing organizations in the state. That is the purpose of the Pope Foundation, is to fund North Carolina's right-wing movement. It goes to the Civitas Institute. And I think Brian was talking about the research that they did about teachers in the state. They're actually most famous for their polls, which through the magic of leading questions, I seem to show that 80% of the public supports whatever position Pope happens to hold. It also goes to the John Locke Foundation, which in addition to attacking unions and teachers and anyone else who might stand up to corporate power, also denies the basic science of climate change. In fact, until recently, they employed a climate scholar who said if there is global warming, it's because we're approaching the end days. Let's just hope he's not in charge of our state science curriculum. The money goes to places like the Pope Center for Higher Educational Policy, which recently put out a report saying that colleges should work harder to, quote, honor the wishes of big millionaire donors to public universities, like our Pope, about who is hired and what classes are taught and how they're taught in public universities. So much for academic freedom and hello to education to the highest bidder. Nationally, Pope is one of the closest allies of the Koch brothers. Who's heard of the Koch brothers? Okay, they've gotten a little more press. These are the billionaire energy tycoons from Kansas. Pope is a regular invitee to their bi-yearly swanky resort. When they go to Colorado and California, they hang out together. They fund many of the same groups. Pope is kind of a Koch Jr. And together, the Kochs and Pope lead Americans for Prosperity, which the Chicago Tribune recently dubbed the leaders of the anti-Obama hate machine. Pope's foundation has given more than $3 million to the Americans for Prosperity Foundation. He's the leader of the 4-person board. So Pope is North Carolina's top money operatives, spending a lot of money, but where's it going? So 2, Pope is bankrolling an extreme agenda that probably wouldn't fly if he didn't have the millions to push it, right? It includes with working with some of the most radical and controversial elements of the Tea Party, including a group, and I find this amazing, that was so off the charts, they were kicked out of the National Tea Party Federation because its leaders kept making racist comments. But that didn't stop Pope and Americans for Prosperity from working with them, giving them a platform. It includes being the architect of the push to dismantle Wake County's landmark desegregation policy, a move that will corral poor students into even poorer schools. It included pushing the restrictive voter ID bill. And again, you might remember, 2010, I don't remember voter ID being a big campaign issue, right? Jobs, the economy, all of a sudden they go into the legislature, voter ID moves to the top of the list. I think it's no coincidence that the Civitas Institute and Americans for Prosperity had also made that a top legislative agenda item. It includes bankrolling the attempt to write discrimination into our marriage discrimination to the Constitution. On and on, this agenda that really wouldn't be able to see the light of day if he didn't have the money to push it. So what's Pope's response to all this? Well, I recently had the pleasure of debating Mr. Pope on the radio. He got a little agitated, but he did say a couple things. First, Pope's approach is to deny, try to distance himself from what his money is doing. All those Tea Party racists that he gave a platform to, Pope said he didn't know them personally. The Koch brothers, he leads a national attack group with them. He hangs out with them at posh California resorts, but doesn't know them very well either. Kind of reminded me of somebody who hires a hitman, but then his hands are clean because he didn't pull the trigger. Heck, he even thinks he's not a member of the 1%. He was asked about that, and he said, yeah, I don't think I'm part of the 1%.
Don't forget he said he likes black people, remember?
Oh, yeah, I'm sure he did. And he said, but he said he's not part of the 1%, which is amazing because according to our calculations, the amount that his family gave to elections in 2010 alone is double what it takes to be in the top 1% in this country. So if denial doesn't work, Pope's second tack is, well, everybody's doing, right? Everybody's spending a lot of money in politics, why can't I do it too? Personally, I don't have $40 million that I inject into the political process on a regular basis. Most people don't. But that's why Pope is the #1 big money man in North Carolina. But if anything, that points to a problem, right? The solution isn't to pump more money into the system, it's to have like campaign finance reform. And last year, Pope's groups were the leaders in trying to dismantle North Carolina's landmark clean elections program to level the playing field. So not just the very rich can run for office, but everybody in the concept of one person, one vote. And you know, Pope, of all people, should understand this. You know, when he needed money to run for lieutenant governor in 1992, he had no problem taking a $330,000 loan from his mom and dad, which to this day he has never repaid. Now he wants to kick out the ladder for everybody else. So in closing, here's the good news, I think, is that people are fighting back against this big money agenda. Over the last year, we've pushed Pope into the National University last year, a historically black college in Durham. And after the legislature voted to slash the budget for the UNC system, Pope dangled the prospect of a $600,000 constitutional law center that he would set up at NC Central. A lot of money for a campus that's had a lot of cutbacks. But the students, the faculty, the alumni, they rose up and they said they didn't want Pope's money. They didn't want to have money. It's pretty amazing. They said they didn't want money that was tied to the Tea Party, that was tied to attacks on voting rights. They stood up and that deal fell through. Another example, last fall, Pope again was pumping as much money as he could into the Wake County School Board race. Not just to candidates directly, but also to his outside groups like Civitas Action. And again, Pope's candidates and that agenda got voted down. Yes. And part of that was because the message was this agenda is tied to narrow special interest money that isn't about the public good, it's about the best for the few. So we've also had successes too. We launched a website called Art Pope Exposed, which has gotten over 25,000 views, and it's also gotten emails from around the state, people saying, I'm not going to shop at Rose's or Maxway anymore. Yeah. I don't want my money going to fund that kind of agenda. And they're working to get the word out about Pope's dangerous influence. So the message to Pope and his political machine is clear to me. You can't hide anymore. People can triumph over big money, and together we can defend our democracy. Thanks.
So I'm going to take a few minutes to wrap up, and since I'm with the AFL-CIO and I represent labor, I'm going to put a worker spin on this legislature. So you heard tonight that Art Pope and this extremist legislature have a far-ranging agenda that includes many issues. And as I said earlier, it can be summed up by calling it a divide-and-conquer agenda. An agenda that seeks to divide the many. A few questions. If you have questions for a specific panelist, let us know. And I ask everybody just take a couple minutes so that we can hear from everyone and say your name and if you represent an organization. Yes, ma'am.
I'm Leslie Boyd. I'm a healthcare activist. I run a small nonprofit called Life on Mike in memory of my son who died because he couldn't get health care. I wanted to ask you, Chris, how much of this crazy legislation comes through ALEC? How much of it is almost word for word through ALEC?
Right, and that's the American Legislative Exchange Council. They're kind of the national group that drafts this legislation. And that voter ID was a great example where they were the ones who in 2010 were saying, here's the money bill that we want all these legislatures to push. We know everybody's talking about jobs and the economy, but we want you to push this thing right here. Had tens of millions of dollars behind them. What's interesting about North Carolina is that it definitely, ALEC is a player. They're actually having a meeting, a policy conference here in just a few weeks, and that might be an interesting thing to pay some attention to. But it's almost like we almost don't even need ALEC because there's such a homegrown thing that Pope has created here. And so in a lot of other states, they don't have this Civitas Institute and John Locke Foundation. Pope has built this empire like you don't even see this in other states, and that's what's so interesting, and it's something to know. Across the country, people are looking at North Carolina. Other big, deep pocket folks like in their states are saying, wow, let's do something like our Pope, you know. And so this really, if in this state we could show that we could beat back a big money agenda like that, that sends a national message. And that's why it's so critical what we're doing here tonight.
I was just going to say, you know, Chris Fitzsimon and I spend a lot of our time, we also read all the crap that the Locke Foundation and the Civitas people put out. And it's a lot of it. It's a lot of stuff. There's 40 people all dedicated to propaganda. They're just, that's where they put all their eggs. They're not lobbying so much. The corporations can do that for them. They're not putting their money into organizing so much. It's mostly into this propaganda war, and they crank out an awful lot of stuff, and so they really don't need ALEC